that we've been developing at my home institution, Rochester Institute of Technology, and it's called the MISHA project, and I'll explain that in just a moment. There's a couple of links here, and I think there's some links a little bit later on as well. To start, I'm going to click with the land acknowledgements. So we have a land acknowledgement here at RIT, and I applied also the principles from ALA in terms of land acknowledgements there. In terms of my positionality, I'm not an academic or research librarian, but I am married to one, so maybe that gives me a bonus point or two. And I teach in an undergraduate degree program that is where I developed and taught all of the technology-based courses in our museum studies degree program. And those courses have included topics that address metadata, informatics, and a number of other disciplines that align well with libraries and academic libraries and research libraries. And our students, after an undergraduate degree, often go and work in the field. And so I have also been affiliated with ACRL for about 20 years, primarily through my work as a choice reviewer, which is something that I have loved and adored working on. And I've written a couple of choice bibliographic essays. So it's truly an honor to be here and to present and to share space with you all here. So I'll go into a little bit of detail here in just a moment with an overview of the presentation and kind of like the layout of where things are. And part of that is predicated upon going through kind of a backstory. So each of these topics here, they're enumerated and they're color-coded, and we'll go through all of them throughout our brief time together. And I've saved plenty of time at the end, I hope, for questions as well. The first thing to kind of think about is the term MISHA itself, which is the multispectral imaging system for historical artifacts. So please don't let the name turn you off or scare you, or just sort of, it seems a little bit maybe unknown if you're not familiar with our project. But I'll explain it in detail, and I have a short video clip that talks about it as well. And it aligns well and is sort of, you'll see some examples of where it's actually holding space in libraries, archives, and museums internationally, in the US primarily, but in other locations as well. The system that we developed here at RIT, which is called the MISHA system, is part of the broader sort of spectrum or continuum of what we would call cultural heritage imaging. And that basically is defined as a field of where you're working with cultural heritage artifacts and you're using imaging principles to create surrogates of those objects. I'm a humanities person myself. I have a PhD in art history, and I'm a professor of history, and I direct an academic program. So I'm not a technologist, but my work aligns there, and I know that that's a space that's familiar also in academic and research libraries. And then I'll refer to RIT, which is my home institution, a number of times throughout the presentation. So we think about our space and our overview and kind of how we came to this place in terms of the project is our work at RIT, where we are trying to foreground cultural heritage for librarians, archivists, preservation practitioners, and developing real-world solutions. So on the next couple of slides, I'll orient you to what our background is. And so the team for our MISHA project and really driving all of our work in cultural heritage imaging is the screen that you see here. Myself as co-director of what we call the Cultural Heritage Imaging Lab, which is a collaboration between museum studies, my home degree program, and the imaging science program, which is in the College of Science. So right away, we have two different colleges at our university working together in partnership to develop this research agenda. I am joined with my colleague, Roger Easton, and we'll see some slides of early work that he's done in just a moment. And he's a professor of imaging science, and he's considered the OG of cultural heritage imaging. He's been doing this work for about 30 years. My colleague, Dave Messenger, who's third over from the left there, and then also, Dave is also in imaging science. And then Tom Rieger, who is from the Library of Congress and also from NEDCC, and he has joined us at RIT as professor of practice. So part of what we think about our team, it's the people that you just saw on the slide, but there's also an extended team, and that's especially comprised of undergraduate students and professional staff from libraries, archives, and museums. So what you're seeing here and on the next slide is just sort of an overview of sort of what this looks like over the past 5-6 years, primarily having undergraduate students from our degree program and other programs working in service of our project and learning along the way, and then also bringing people to RIT to learn together, to learn about the MISHA project. And so this is an image from our past summer. We did a summer seminar here, a week-long seminar for folks. In addition, we have developed our Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, and that's with the brief history of cultural heritage imaging. So point number 2 in our laundry list of points today. And that's the brief history of cultural heritage imaging at RIT. And that started on the far left is an image from 1995, so about 30 years ago, with a colleague of Rogers who was working on imaging the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he was working on a system that you're seeing just barely there by his hand, using a Kodak DCS 100 camera. And that camera was 1.3 megapixels and cost about $25,000 at the time. I should have mentioned Rochester is the home of Xerox and Kodak and a number of imaging businesses and industries. And so it's a natural fit to have an imaging science program here and work around imaging. In addition, my colleague Roger has developed and was the lead on the imaging project known as the Archimedes palimpsest, which is what you're seeing there on the slide. So that project was started and stopped a number of different times over the years, and it was revealed to have disclosed new information about the Archimedes. And I can continue and answer questions about that if people have them. So that's the sort of background, the sort of like early days. And then there was about a period of about 10 or so years where we were sort of pivoting. I wasn't at RIT yet, but Dave and Roger were sort of pivoting into like what might be next. And that is the MISHA project. So with this project, we have defined a way of taking a very high-end technology that's neither costly nor easy to use. So both of those things are not part of the framework, and make it less costly. In fact, it's about $6,000, $7,000 to build a system yourself, as opposed to $200,000, which is what the price point is for a high-end system. And our system is that we've developed and made open source, and the plans and the software are available online for you to download. That is also much more user-friendly, so that people like me and colleagues in libraries, archives, and museums can use the system. So the overview is that we were first funded in 2020 by the National Endowment for the Humanities for a research and development grant to see if we could actually do what we said we were aiming to do, which is to develop the system and software, and then to train non-scientists, insert my museum studies students, how to use the system, and then to create educational information that could be shared so that people could learn how to use the system and use it themselves. So that was the first grant practice that we had, and that was our funding from 2020 until 2024. So we started the project during COVID, and it was a 3-year grant that we extended for 1 year, and had that in operation for 4 years. We were awarded a second grant, an add-on grant, and that was awarded in 2020, late 2024, but it was terminated in April of 2025, and that would have extended our education and training programs. We are still committed to doing that work, and so instances like this, like doing presentations and so forth, but we're doing that on our own sort of funding stream or locating other ways to support that effort. And our goal is really to provide opportunities and open source resources for everyone to use, share, and make their own. On the right is the system itself, and then next, I think, is a short video about it. So it's about 1 minute.
Multi-spectrum imaging system, and that helps us to uncover text that's faded or erased or damaged, and that helps historians and curators to read text that possibly hasn't been visible for thousands of years. we realized that while there are commercial systems out there that do advanced multispectral imaging, they're very expensive and they're very difficult to use, and they're out of reach for most institutions. We wrote a proposal for the National Endowment for the Humanities, believing that we could develop a low-cost imaging system and that we could make it very easy to use. We are working together in museum studies in partnership with scientists from imaging science, and we launched the system in April of 2024 at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. At that event, we made available the system plans so that you could build it yourself, and also the software. Over the past year, we've seen tremendous growth and interest in people wanting to build their own systems. We image in 16 different colors. And so by combining all of these 16 different images from the ultraviolet all the way up to the infrared, beyond what the human visual system is sensitive to, we can extract information from objects that is not visible to the naked eye just in a normal camera.
So that video kind of puts life to sort of the content that I was sharing before. And I'll talk about results and kind of like what the system actually does a little bit later. But I want to jump into the leadership part of it because I think that's an important framing for understanding like how this technology and how the sort of the way that this project has evolved. It really kind of hit some points on leadership. It's not that we started out with this agenda of how we would lead this effort, which is very collaborative across our university, and then a collaborative within the United States, and then internationally. We didn't set out with an agenda and say, okay, we're going to follow these leadership principles, but instead, in reflecting and thinking back, like how has this project evolved? Here's kind of where I see us situated, and I think these will probably be some terms that are familiar to you all, or at least ways of thinking, ways of leading, ways of working. I think of this as being very much collaborative work. And this collaborative work cannot get done by us unless we work in partnership with other people. And that requires then a leadership that kind of oscillates back and forth between these two ecosystems of distributed and collaborative leadership. And the oscillation is done, to me, I think it's in order to meet the needs of the project, as well as the educational ecosystem of which it is a part. So if it's a classroom setting and we're talking about MISHA and we're teaching students in one of my museum studies courses how it works as a new and evolving technology, that's one kind of framing and one kind of leadership that's being inculcated at an open house where we're showing how the system works on site and in person, a researcher visit when someone's coming with a research question or bringing an object to be imaged, or an offsite at an academic institution or a library. So this work that we're doing relies upon our collaboration with other disciplines at our university, certainly including experts from humanities fields, notably collections professionals, curators, and librarians who are the stewards of our collections, as well as other disciplines that we have at RIT, like imaging science, color science. We are also the home for Image Permanence Institute, which is a research hub based here at RIT that deals with preservation and sustainability practices and collections. And we also have engineering, computing, 3D printing, AI, et cetera. So there's this rich flourishing that I see here at our university, and I'm sure that people can relate to that sort of framing at your own institutions and maybe even different principles and practices there. And it's that diversity of expertise and knowledge that leads to the overlapping of these ecosystems. And so together, the way we operate or have operated is that we share questions, methods, and knowledge. And then together we aim to surface new information, new materials, new knowledge about collections. Our system is usable on, the MISHA system is usable on sheet leaf folio collections, about 11 by 17, but anything larger than that can be imaged in sections and segmented and stitched together. We are working on a 3D apparatus that would enable MISHA to be doing 3D imaging as well. So I'll talk about that a little bit. But then what does this actually look like in practice? Like, what does this actually look like out in the wild? And I think for that, we can kind of think about it in terms of the early days when we were working with a scientific practice and principle, this idea of imaging, which is ostensibly a camera, a lens, and LED panels, and taking images of these objects. That's a scientific principle that we are then asking or situating within the space of non-scientists. So enter how it appears in the wild initially would be our three students, Amara, Katie, and Courtney. And they were the ones who really lifted off and asked the very tough questions of the scientists and really held their own against the researchers and scientists in terms of how to interface with the system, how to understand how it works, how to break the software and code so that it was usable for someone who didn't actually write it, and trying to sort of leverage their expertise as young undergraduates in trying to help then move the field forward by iterating our first design for the MISHA system. So they definitely had this sense of distributed leadership, even in their young undergraduate selves. And they used that as a way to then help the project and move the project further. Then we have always really moved through this journey of building out the 25-year legacy that is part of Roger's story, his origin story, and then calling upon connections that would ostensibly enable us to do both of these approaches, which is to challenge traditional hierarchies, support inclusivity, and enable organizations to be adaptive, innovative, and responsive by the use of the system. So what I'm saying with this is that initially we had the students and myself working on that early iteration, sort of version one of MISHA. And then once we had that, it's like, okay, so what do we do from here? So how do we take that and bring it forward? And to do that would require collaborating with people outside of the university then. And so that was a really important part of our work. And what we ended up doing then is then taking MISHA on the road and going in 2022 is when we really started doing that, 2022, 2023, and trying to set up the system in various locations. So here we're at a local museum and asking if we could image from their collections to then extend beyond the reaches of our lab and our university. How it also appears in the wild is then people coming to us to learn by doing and by learning by doing at RIT in our lab and otherwise. So what you're looking at here are a couple of images on the top left and bottom are from our summer seminar when we brought people here, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Brought people here to learn how to do cultural heritage imaging. And then on the right-hand side is when we brought staff from the National Library of Columbia, thanks to Whiting Foundation funding, to learn how to use the MISHA system. They have two MISHA systems at the National Library in Bogota. That also looks like this whole process, the sort of workflow and sharing expertise with one another when you're actually doing the imaging. So these are images from the summer seminar when we host a free seminar. We'll also do it this coming summer in 2026. And we had people apply, and they could apply to be a student for a week here at RIT to learn everything they could within reason about cultural heritage imaging and specifically the MISHA project and the MISHA system. And then they were sort of formed into small groups to then work with the system and image things that hadn't been imaged previously to sort of produce some results. So at the left, you're seeing one of our students from this past summer. And these, I should mention, these students are librarians, archivists, curators, researchers, fellows working in academic and research libraries and a range of other institutions. And they came from all over the US and came to Rochester for a week in July. So on the far left is one of our students from summer seminar handling one of the Ege portfolios, so a illuminated manuscript from 14th century. And then in the middle is the capture process, which is when you're using the lights, the camera, and the LED panels to illuminate the object, as we saw with the video. And so you're situating, focusing. It's a 20 megapixel camera, and I can go into more about the technical details, but the goal is that you're using a camera that stays in focus across those 16 different wavelengths so that I can capture information that is not visible with the naked eye. And then on the right-hand side, we're seeing beginning results of some processing that was done literally on the fly after using the system and learning how to use the system for about an afternoon. So some of the key partners, and I'll mention a couple people here specifically on a couple of slides, but This is not an exhaustive list because to make an exhaustive list makes the print really small. But I'm happy to share other information about other partners that have been involved in this work. Um, so we have done demonstrations of MISHA where we take a system to a location and image from collections. We've done that at a number of institutions, both in our area or areas where we were traveling anyway to do something else for a conference or what have you. So that's on the left there. We also loan out systems. With the NEH funding, it was intended that it would be entirely free. Now we just ask people to pay for it or pick it up and then also do the return for that. So whatever that amounts to with FedEx, it's around $150, I think, to have it FedEx to you in the US. And so we have been able to loan the system to a number of different places so that people can then build it there, try it out, see if it works with their collections, what kind of research questions they have around their own collections, and then see if it's something that they'd like to add to their continuum of digital practices at their own institution. So a couple of these places I will talk about shortly. Also for our key partners, and again, we could not do this work without the collaboration of these partners because they give us feedback, but they also are using the system and letting us know the range and capacities that it has. We have some collections at RIT, but obviously when you go out and extend beyond the reaches of all of these institutions and their collections, you really can build some momentum and have a multiplier factor. Places that have built their own or that have been built with our assistance are listed there on the left in the United States, and then internationally are on the right. And again, this is a partial list in and of itself. But then to think back and return then to how this looks or what it looks like at our institution, one of the early, very early moments was the first version of, or really the precursor to the MISHA system, was built by a group of freshman imaging students in imaging science, and they were called upon to image something to see if it would fluoresce. In other words, would it illuminate under particular wavelengths? And so they contacted the curator of the Carey collection, which functions as our rare book manuscript font and letterpress type collection at RIT, Dr. Stephen Galbraith. And lo and behold, the item that they had selected, or one of the items, which is one of the images I'll show you shortly, was palimpsested. So it was a 14th and 15th century manuscript that had been scraped away, and additional information and illumination was put on top of that image. And that was not known to have been palimpsested. And it was a discovery made by those students that then led to the MISHA project itself and our building the system and the funding from the NEH. So that sort of kernel of this is how we can do it at RET, but what happens when you release the system out into the wild and send it on loan? That's what the next couple slides are about. And the key partners that we've had in this work, I had the slide that had the list of several of them. But in addition, there are specific people who have really sort of embraced what the MISHA framework, which is what we like to think of it, is like a framework or a starting point for dipping your toe in the water of multispectral imaging as a continuum of practices. One of the originators who borrowed from us early in 2022 was Andrew Mancuso, Naomi Langer, and now Zach Fox at Case Western Reserve University. They borrowed a MISHA system, and not only did they borrow the MISHA system, but then they took MISHA on the road. And as you can see from the map, we made a story map, an ArcGIS story map of their travels. They've also blogged about it as well. But the system went from Rochester to Cleveland and then went basically up and down the I-71 corridor and imaged things along the way. And that gave us some really good user experience and field data of how it works in the wild. And it's also a train the trainer model where you're distributing that leadership capacity across people who have had a system for a couple of months and are taking it on the road to see if they can sort of pollinate some interest, but also share the love of MISHA and see what's out there and what can be imaged. Another example is Mitch Sumner, who's head of preservation, digital preservation and processing at Washington University in St. Louis. So he came to RIT to visit us in the summer of 2022. And what you're looking at here, he brought some materials and said, I'd heard about the MISHA system. I'm interested in it. And I'm wondering if this is something we'd want to work into our framework. of digital practices. And so these are images from 2022 when he came and learned how to use the system, our students working in the lab, and some of the results. This is a paste down. You can see a book plate and then imaging beneath it. This is fax paper that I have some other results with fax paper that I'll show you shortly that really just show it illuminate. And you can recover text pretty easily. Then I took a system out there. I was going out to Arkansas for some other work. And so I took a system out there, drove it out there in 2023, pulled up to WashU, unloaded it, and said, okay, here you go. And sure enough, within about 30 minutes, Mitch had built the system there in their preservation area of their division of their library offsite, and he started imaging. They also turned that into a research project for a student assistant, a student worker in the library over the summer, was charged with the task then of MISHAing this collection of papyrus fragments that they had and produced some pretty stunning results with that. As a result, they are now building their own system at WashU, and I think they've actually come pretty far in building it so that they'll be able to add it to their workflow. In addition, we have worked with folks like Dot Porter from University of Pennsylvania, and she was interested in MISHA. She had heard about the MISHA system. She came to Rochester for a presentation, to give a presentation. And then we started talking about like, what would that look like in her environment? And so she invited us to come while she was teaching a Ritter Book School workshop for a week at Penn. And so we came on the last day and kind of did a demo, about 15 minutes of a demo, and then asked the students to start doing some imaging. And she told us later after the workshop, and she's now building her own system, the quote on the lower left there, she could see herself just having the students in as part of an existing programming or new programming and training people to come do this. And she felt like it was the first time she had had a demo where this was something that they could actually do. So there she is giving the thumbs up because she learned how to capture and process in about 30 minutes. And then here we are with some of her students. So everyone got their hand at trying to use the system and produce some results. Another collaborator or one of our key partners has been the University of Toronto. And they are building, actually, they have already built their own system and they've been producing some pretty amazing results. They got all of the materials, they built their system, and then Dave and I went over this past summer and did some sort of capture and processing with them, and they were already producing some results. They're on the right, they're talking with one of the curators of their collections about basically a redaction on some of their Judaica material. So now that we know like the evolution of the project and sort of who some of the key partners have been, although there are many, many others, I wanted to talk a little bit about results. So you kind of envision like what would this look like in your environment, or what kind of materials might you have within your broadest collections that might find use with MISHA. And so I mentioned earlier, there's like kind of two parts. There's the capture and the processing. And so in the images that I'll show you here in just a moment, I'll go over them rather briefly, but I'm happy to take questions at the end. The way that we capture the images, we're taking those pictures out for those 16 different wavelengths. We do produce what's called a true color image, which is what you're seeing here. In some cases, you can produce a result that is visible in like a gray panel, or like the gray scale view, which is what you're seeing here. So this is the item that I mentioned earlier, and I'll show a better image of it shortly, that was palimpsested. So this is how it appears with, quote, the naked eye. In a grayscale result of that compression of all of those 16 images, we reveal the palimpsest, which is that cursive writing across. And it's literally underneath that illumination. And then the backbone of processing is what this is on the right, which is called a false color. And the way that works is you're basically taking an RGB image, a red, green, and blue image, which is like a true color image. And instead of having it appear how it appears through your human visual system, which is rather limited, you're extending that capacity so that you can see beyond the human vision system. And when you do that, you're basically shuffling those bands so that you can see things that are not visible with the naked eye. And so the items appear in these sort of funky colors because you're distributing those nanometers into different channels than they normally appear. At the end of the day, what we're saying is what you're looking at on the right can give you information about the object that you're seeing on the left in true color. So what you're looking at the right gives you more information than what your human visual system can see. And that's what each of these examples will show. So this example here, it's parchment, so 15th century parchment. It actually is palimpsested. You can see just like a hint right here that there might be something there, but in fact it was fully palimpsested where some writing was scraped away and the page was turned so that this antiphonal leaf could be written on top of it. And the difference in those years is about 100 years. This is an example of an 18th century scroll. It's called the Book of Esther. And these are all collections from RIT with the exception of one, the fire damaged one. So they're ones that we're able to share and they're ones that are at our university. And so this item, because it's a Torah scroll, and it's from the Book of Esther, and because it's a scroll, it's handled, the end is handled quite a lot. And so that has worn away quite a bit. So knowing what those images were was important to the curators of that collection. It looks like something that was interpreted as maybe like a human figure or something of that sort. But after imaging and processing, the images reveal much more information about flowers. There's a foliage pattern here, and then over here is a lion. And that actually ended up being the secret to the information about this object, because that actually is half of a heraldic shield that dated this very specifically to the 18th century. Another example here, which might be more familiar, is a paste down. So this piece of paper is pasted down on material beneath it, and that's able to be recovered. The subtext, the text beneath, is able to be recovered with the MISHA system. Another example, same book, but just the end or the back. And that's the material that's beneath it. So the paper has been pasted down on top, and the system can read beneath that. Example like this is from the New York State fire in 1911, of which over 1 million objects, artifacts, or sheet leaf folio were destroyed. 725,000 of them were books and documents like this item here. So these have been, a number of them have been encapsulated and they're not able to be handled by visitors. So we've gone to the New York State Library in Albany and imaged a number of these materials over the past 2 years just to sort of provide more access to them. So what you're looking at is the fire damaged item that's been backed with gauze. And then the way, so you're looking at the topmost portion. And with the MISHA system, we're able to pull back that information so that it's fully legible where it wasn't before. Another example of that same collection from New York State is recovering the charred fragments here. This is how it appears in visible light with the naked eye, and then all of that can be pulled back by processing it, which is what this information communicates, which is the false color information. Another example is from our collections. This is an art example. And it's from the Dyer Art Center, which is at RIT. This is a case where the left is the painting as you would see it. It's a smaller painting. And on the right, you can reveal all of the underdrawings, all of the annotations and emendations that the artist made. And this is fragmentary evidence of process. But now, because of this and some of the other items that we've imaged from the collection, that is the work of deaf artist Harry Williams. We know much more about the process and his artistic practice to his work. This is the example of fax paper that I mentioned. There was one from WashU that I showed earlier, but this is an example from our collection. So this is, I mean, we're probably familiar with it, but this is one example of the thermal fax paper was fugitive. It really sort of didn't last very long after the actual transmission of the communication. And so on the left, you see an annotation and drawings of a landscape architecture features that were being communicated to designers that we have the collections of at RIT. And on the left is the way the fax paper appears. And with very minimal processing, we can pull back all of that information. So you may have access to fax paper at your institution or other contexts, and maybe this is sort of springing some ideas for you. And then this is the Ege collection. This is Ege 30 from the work of Otto F. Ege, who separated out all of these different manuscripts. And then he's a biblioclast, so he cut them up so that they could then be assembled into sets that were sold to public libraries, universities, academic institutions, etc. So this is and I showed this one at the beginning to talk about like the process for creating a false color. So in this particular case, the illumination at the top is from the 1400s, and the writing at the bottom is from about 20 years earlier. So this beautiful book of hours, this beautiful illumination actually covers up what you're seeing here on the right, which is sort of a quotidian document. It's about the transfer of prisoners from one place to another in France. And it's about 20 years earlier to when this beautiful illumination was made. So there's definitely a lot of information that can be gleaned just even from that very context that we uncovered from the illumination and the palimpsesting. And this brings up an interesting sort of shift in terms of thinking like larger picture, like how does our work then coalesce and sort of forge into pathways of sharing that information. So like what would be required then for an end researcher, an end user to then know this information? So part of what we're thinking about and part of some of our next phase questions are like, how can we communicate that information about that palimpsest to people who are researching the digital collections or the library catalog? And that's something we're sort of opening up for further conversation. There's already quite a bit of conversation about this particular collection of Otto F. Ege works. So there are collections that exist throughout the United States and various, they've been fragmented out. So the work of some scholars and librarians have created this database called Fragmentarium, and you're seeing with the arrow there, the write-up about this particular collection, Leaf 30 in that collection. And that group of researchers, scholars, librarians, on the right shows the founding partners and their project partners. They are pulling together resources to provide sort of one-stop shopping for these fragments that exist at multiple collections internationally. So I think this is an interesting way to sort of grapple with this idea of distributed and collaborative leadership around how we can bring together information about what have been ostensibly fragmented collections. That work with Fragmentarium then is also building upon work of other libraries and librarianship, specifically the work at the Getty with their archival files related to our auction catalogs and sales, so that you can then track back and figure out where these collections, where they came from initially and how they were then ostensibly broken up and dispersed across multitude of collections. And then, of course, the work at the Schoenberg database of manuscripts at Penn is another sort of guiding light in this work of fragments and fragmentarium. So part of what we try to think about, so like what can we do in our work? And part of that is around building community. And so we are looking at ways of building community around imaging practices. So we feel like that's one of our important purposes in this space as an academic institution, as a research lab, working in consort with libraries, archives, and museums. So one of the things that we've done recently is we hosted a worldwide MISHA Day, which was a year to the date after we launched the system. So it was 1 year after April 9th of 2024. So it was April 9th of 2025. And up on the right, you see an image that shows the individuals who were presenting that day. And the goal for that was to have people share out what they were doing with their MISHA system, how it was working, and how that work was going for them. We are also thinking about ways like what are the tools and attributes that we have and what are the resources and how can we share them out? And how do we do that in a way that shows mutual trust and respect for diverse expertise? So we know some things, but we build and learn and grow together, and that we try to provide ways for our resources to be shared with a broader community through things like OERs, but then also be improved with feedback, and then also share that knowledge, share that information across multitudes of communities. We also are really very much interested in hosting convenings, and we've been doing that both online and on site, as I mentioned earlier. So we do online and on site. We have resources available online on our website that people can download and access to learn more about our system and what it does. And we're also trying very much to enable institutions then to figure out if standing up something like the system would be helpful for them. And they can sort of look at the website, email us, ask questions, that kind of work. But all of that is really kind of thinking through what does leadership and practice look like out in the wild. So we talked about sort of what does it look like when we're sort of standing up a system and getting going. And I think this slide encapsulates that. It's our researcher friends, our colleagues from the National Library of Columbia, working with myself and the students over the summer and basically learning how to do this together, learning how to apply the principles of multispectral imaging to their own environment, and then distributing that knowledge when they get back home with their colleagues at their institution. So for us, part of what we've been doing is thinking about an idea, a solution, and expanding it. And so this graphic sort of explicates how that looks. So this emergent idea, thinking back to Courtney and Amara and Katie starting out with the scientists and sort of getting that first pass, the MISHA 1.0 going. Then figuring out that yes, we can sort of plunge ahead, distribute systems, get feedback, and then make it so that we can launch something effectively last year, and then build out that community and expand it to reach new levels of achievement. That also is sort of a way of thinking about the evolution of our project, which is explained here. And part of what that also means is that our lab, which is the Cultural Heritage Imaging Lab, does far more beyond just the MISHA project. That's one of several sort of facets of our research in the space of cultural heritage imaging. And part of what we think leadership and practice looks like is dissemination and results. So with that, I think I will stop and then take any questions.
How were you, Julie, able to collaborate with so many different types of institutions?
I think there's like a daisy chain, like literally someone will say, folks at Stanford reached out to us because they had heard about us from colleagues at University of Toronto. So I think it's literally that daisy chain pollination of people hearing about it at a workshop or seminar, or someone going to a workshop and then returning and talking about it with a colleague who then shares it with another colleague. And it's really inspiring. I mean, it's really inspiring to see kind of interest, and we always are sort of thinking about ways that we can share what we're doing, but in a way that meets people where they are. Sometimes people are curious about what the system can do. And so, we have information online, but I'm happy to meet with somebody or shoot them an email with some information and follow up with some questions. Because I think part of what is the space that we work in is thinking about ways that technology can be democratized, not just in terms of price point and building it yourself, but in terms of lowering that barrier of entry so that you don't need to be a PhD in imaging science to understand the software. And also for me personally, it's about canonicity and sort of reducing the canonicity so that not just the best superlative most amazing objects have a pathway to being imaged because a very expensive system exists at a well-endowed library that can afford $200,000 equipment. but instead that any object is worthy of being MISHA'd, if you're making a verb out of it. The fax paper of some drawings that we have literally thousands of those sheets, those are all equally important on some level. They all contain information that isn't there any longer. And so I think trying to sort of forge opportunities for people so that the technology does seem accessible and within reach, and also something that can be learned and translated into new contexts is really important. And I think that's helped to facilitate people's interest in what we're doing.
That's cool. Wait, we have to talk about that again later. So Deborah asks, how does MISHA compare to other imaging systems? Are there specific elements that make it unique?
Yeah. So the big picture, the much more expensive systems are better systems. There's no doubt. You get what you're paying for. When you're buying a system like a Megavision system, and I'm friends with Ken Boydston who makes this system. So, and he knows, and he's actually been to my house for a barbecue. So we know what each other does, and we know that we each have a space, right, that we're working in. His system is a six-figure system. It also has a much higher megapixel count. So the resolution is going to be much better because instead of 20 megapixels, you're dealing with 150 megapixels. So the image, I don't want to say the image quality is going to be better, but you're working with higher resolution. However, and there's other functionalities that you can do beyond the 16 band imaging that we're doing. However, to use that system, in addition to the price point, is a very complicated software. And many people who use that system actually do acknowledge that their software, both for capture and for other modes, is very, very complicated to use. Our system is 20 megapixel, but you can still get good results. And we think of it as like a survey instrument of seeing if there's something there, and maybe you'll get really good results, which a lot of our users have gotten really good results. But in some cases, if there's something that needs more work or some more attention done to it, then it's like, okay, well, maybe this could be imaged somewhere else, or the object could be taken somewhere to be imaged if it warrants further inquiry in terms of imaging. But the big picture is the cost, the capability, the camera, and then also ours is very portable, easy to set up, user friendly. It can be set up in about 15 minutes, 15, whereas the more sophisticated systems do require a more sophisticated setup. Our system is also very portable. It can be used, we've used it on a generator on our campus. We were testing that out a couple of years ago. It's very portable in that it can be set up and taken down very quickly and easily. So it allows for flexibility in that sense too.
We have another question from Tara. I believe it's Tally. Sorry, excuse me. Sorry, I couldn't see the name. This is really amazing for institutions who have started using this. How accessible is it to various staff in different positions? I guess my question for the add-on to that is for student workers. Is it limited to certain levels of staff or certain categories of material? I would love to use it in some of the things I'm cataloging.
Yeah. So in terms of like, thank you for the questions. In terms of how it works out in the wild. So like every institution, when they borrow a system from us, or if they're building their own system, they kind of set their own parameters on sort of what they're doing and what the workflow actually is. I do know from WashU, they did task a student assistant who was working there over the summer in 2023. That was the student assistant's job, to image, to learn MISHA, to image, and to sort of communicate the findings back to the person who was in charge of that particular collection. In other cases, it's sort of set up so that particular entities have the sort of the key to the castle, if it were. Like at University of Toronto, they affectionately call their MISHA room the sensory deprivation chamber, but it's actually in the Fisher Library. And so in one of the spaces at Fisher Library, they have their MISHA set up, and there's a person who is the Mark Andrews postdoctoral fellow that person, Stephanie, is in charge of the MISHA. And if anything needs to be MISHA, they go through Stephanie. And either the person can MISHA it themselves if they know how to use it, or they work with Stephanie to coordinate a time for it to be imaged. So it's sort of set up on everyone's sort of system is their own sort of way and workflow and sort of their own ecosystem, whatever serves them best. In terms of us, when we lend them out to people, we just ask people to let us know sort of what the framework is going to be that they're situating it in, what context. And we are completely happy with the more people who have access to it at an institution. So in your particular case, if you were to borrow a system and then have it with some of the things that you're cataloging and image it, that would be great. Like if that makes sense in your environment, that would be wonderful. So.
Does anyone have any other questions? You can turn off your mic if you want, or type them into the chat. Well, thank you all for coming today. We appreciate spending your time. Thank you for joining us for an ACRL leadership discussion group. If you're new, you're welcome. We have another webinar coming up at Kindness in Action by Helen Rimmer, excuse me. I believe December 16th. I hope you join us then. Thank you again for spending your afternoon with us. Julie, it was amazing. This is very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. I'll put my email in the chat in case anybody has questions too.